Well, welcome everyone. This is David Galloway for the Centre for Intelligent Design in the UK. And this is another webinar in our series. We had a series on the design and virology back in the summer when we hosted, amongst others, Mike Behe. And then our more recent episodes, such as last month's episode, highlighted the work of people like Steve Meyer and Jim Tour on the mystery of life's origin. So you'll find these on our YouTube channel if you want to pick them up and maybe missed them the first time around. And I can certainly recommend that they are well worth spending some time engaging with. It's a real pleasure this evening to welcome Dr. Doug Axe. I'm sure the title of his talk has drawn many people into this session, How 4-Year-Olds Grasp Design Better Than Most Biology Professors. Doug has been intermittently connected with us in C4ID for several years. We almost persuaded him to come and have a speaking opportunity back a few years ago, and we're certainly looking forward to welcoming him again to the UK. But we've been watching, as many of you have too, his output with great interest. And Doug, it's really great to have you with us today. He's one of the experimental scientists who has been practically testing the validity of evolutionary mechanisms. So what he has to say is of great importance and interest. Doug has been involved in molecular biology research for many years. After he completed his PhD at Caltech, he held appointments in the University of Cambridge in England. And his research, which examines the functional and structural constraints of the evolution of proteins and protein systems, has been featured in many scientific journals. And he's also well known as the author or co-author of several important books and blog posts and articles and so on. Certainly his book, Undeniable, How Biology Confirms Our Intuition That Life is Designed, is one of the most important contributions, and he'll probably be speaking about some of that material this evening. He's also co-author of another book, Science of Human Origins, and more recently, The Price of Panic, which you may hear a little bit about this evening. So tonight it's great because Doug is still the director of the Biologic Institute. He is the founding editor of the journal Biocomplexity, and he's also the Maxwell Professor of Molecular Biology at Biola. So it's interesting if you check people out on the internet, if you check him out on the so-called rational wiki pages, they give him less than fulsome praise. He's attracted the ire of dyed-in-the-wool naturalists and Darwin disciples like P.Z. Myers and Larry Moran, who are both active on the blogosphere, and they are expert users, it seems to me, of the genetic fallacy. And to be honest, it's become a little tiresome to see how they repeatedly fail to really engage the discussion and have an adult debate without descending into ad hominem attacks. But you're here today to hear this lecture straight off the bat. And so, Doug, welcome. Can I, at this stage, invite you to go ahead and give your talk? And then David Williams will be chairing our Q&A. So if you'd like to post a question, use the chat facility on YouTube. But right now, listen as Doug speaks to us on how 4-year-olds grasp design better than most biology professors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, organizers, and thank you, David. Yes, my wife and I lived in Cambridge for 14 years and fell in love with Great Britain. We became dual citizens, in fact, in the time that we were there, had our first 2 children, twins, born while we were there in Cambridge. And if you do invite me out for a talk, I guarantee my wife will want to come with me because we love going back there. So let me, without further delay, share my screen. And by now, we know this technology like the back of our hands. What I'm going to do, I'm doing this the same way that I do it for my lectures now, which have been all online here at Biola for some time since last spring. And I was not a big fan of it, and I still prefer to be in person. So what I'm doing is PowerPoint, but not the way it would be if we were gathered in one room where I do presentation mode. I just kind of walk through the way I view the slides myself, because it tends to be less glitchy that way. So deliberately provocative title, How 4-Year-Olds Grasp Design Better Than Most Biology Professors. It's drawing from the work in Undeniable, the book that David mentioned, but I'm not going, straight through the sort of main points of Undeniable. It's touching on points that are all made in Undeniable, but I change this talk up every time I give it for the 4 years that I've been giving it. So it looks quite different from the book if you've read the book. But here's the book, which came out in 2016. I think it was summer of 2016 now, so a little over 4 years ago. And if I just back up and talk a little bit about what I was thinking before I wrote the book and my approach to the book, I had spent, by the time HarperCollins was giving me an opportunity to write this, I had spent really decades of work doing research, some on my own and some with other people joining me, leading a laboratory in the Seattle area, looking at molecular biology and specifically at molecular evolution, and more specifically at the adequacy or not of the Darwinian mechanism for explaining the origin of new genes. So it's kind of a small scale version of the broader question of the adequacy of the Darwinian mechanism. Instead of asking, though, whether random mutation and natural selection over, hundreds of millions or billions of years can convert single-celled simple organisms into peacocks and oak trees and humans, I was asking whether over billions of years, random mutation and natural selection can convert simple genes into new genes that encode new protein structures. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a minute, that have new functions. So can invention work? Can the evolutionary mechanism that Darwin proposed and the modern version of it explain the invention of anything that's new and clever? And I felt early on, as I was approaching this work, really in my graduate student years, that the best way to tackle this would be to look at single genes. Much harder to answer it if you're looking at peacocks or oak trees or humans. But if you can answer this at the level of single genes, then you really will have an answer at the higher level as well. Because if it doesn't work at the level of single genes, then it certainly doesn't work at the level of new organs, new organisms, new body plans. And then as I was thinking about the book and thinking about the strategy, the approach I would take for the book, one approach would have been to take all of the technical work that I and colleagues had done over the years and give a simplified explanation of it for a mostly non-technical readership. And that would have been a reasonable approach, but I was bothered by an aspect of that. And that is, I knew that if I took that approach, despite the fact that I have expertise in saying, here's what I found, you can trust me, I knew, just as David referred to, that there's a whole group of people who are also experts who will say, you shouldn't trust what he said. That despite what Axe has said, evolutionary biology is moving along just fine. No one has closed their evolutionary biology departments at any of the major research universities. So he's got it wrong. And really, I wanted to get away from the idea that the basic question here is a question for experts. And I really felt as though that's not true, that at root here, there is a commonsensical question that you do not have to have a PhD to know the correct answer to this. And I felt as though I wanted to frame the book around that commonsensical way of thinking, instead of perpetuating the idea that you have to be an expert to know the truth here. Because since most of us will never be experts, if you do have to be an expert to know the truth here, then we're like spectators at a tennis match. One side makes a point, the other side returns it, the other side returns it, and you end up just picking your side, but nothing gets resolved. And I just don't think that's the way we should view this. I don't think that's the way it is. So let me try to convince you that there are subjects where common sense actually performs better than expertise. Not all expertise, but there can be people who are truly experts in areas who believe things to be true and have come to believe them through their expert work that a non-expert viewing from the outside would say, look, I don't know how you got there and I can't read all your technical papers, but I know you're wrong. And an early example of that would be some of the philosophical questions that have been asked from the very beginning, early days of philosophy. So back to the ancient Greek philosophers, this was one of them, the question of existence. What is the nature of existence? What is the sum total of things that do exist? And how can we know that they do exist? There's, you may not have heard, you've heard of lots of other Greek philosophers, but probably not this guy, Gorgias, who did work on precisely that question, the question of existence. And after devoting his career work to this and writing extensively on it, he came to this conclusion: nothing exists. Now, again, I'm sure he thought very long and hard before he came to this conclusion, and I'm sure most of us would have a hard time wading through all the things that he wrote. And yet, we don't have to be experts to know that he got it wrong, right? We know that things do exist, and somehow he got so caught up in his micro view of his subject that he lost the ability, evidently, to just stand back and know what is basically obvious from a commonsensical point of view. I'm going to ask also, I'm assuming that you can see my pointer, and David or somebody, can someone confirm that? I'm assuming you can see my pointer. So I'm going to use my pointer as though you can see it. And I think I can also turn on. Okay. So I'm claiming that the same thing is true on the question of origins, namely that it is possible for people to have genuine expertise and to have poured themselves into biological origins questions for decades, for an entire career, and yet get something wrong in a way that is obviously wrong, such that a non-expert, even a child, can see that they've got it wrong. It's interesting, as I was starting work on the book, I came across this quote by UC Berkeley psychology professor named Alison Gopnik. She wrote in an article that by elementary school age, children start to invoke an ultimate godlike designer to explain the complexity of the world around them, even children brought up as atheists. So her point here was that it doesn't seem to require theistic or Christian or believing parents indoctrinating or instructing children for them to see the world in a theistic way. In fact, the opposite can be true. You can have atheistic parents who are bringing up their children to be atheists, and they find that by the age of 4 or so years, their children, when they look at a butterfly outside in the garden, see it as something that was made by a godlike designer. It's not that someone has told them to see it this way. It seems to be innate that children automatically see the world this way. And this came out in an article that was in, this quote is from this article in the Wall Street Journal that came out several years ago. Gopnik was not stating this approvingly. She was, like many others, she was bothered by the fact that children have this innate tendency to appeal to design and to explain the complexity of the world around them through design and through a godlike designer. And she thought the answer to this was to start educating children from a very early age on the true explanation for life, which by her worldview is not design, but a materialist or a naturalist evolutionary process, namely the one that Charles Darwin articulated in 1859. So if Gopnik is correct about this, this is the picture. It's an elitist picture of science in that it takes the people who are in the know to be those who are experts. They have been trained as academics. They are the ones who tell the rest of us who are down here in our state of ignorance. They are the ones who declare the truth to us. And apart from their declaration and apart from their exhortation and teaching, we would be lost because we're born in a state of ignorance, and only by expert training do we remove ourselves from that state of ignorance. However, if the 4-year-olds are right, then the picture looks more like this, doesn't it? The very people who think that they know the most actually have confused themselves and know the least. And the people who are simply reasoning commonsensically, simply viewing things and trying to understand them without any pretense of expertise, just simply looking at things and trying to understand the way they are, actually understand things quite well if the 4-year-olds are right. So the 4-year-olds and most of the rest of us are here understanding the big question of origins just fine. And the experts are down here having dug a ditch for themselves and having been caught in it. And really, this is, there's something very much like what I want to call it, peer pressure. Peer review is something that academics are known for, but there's something more base called peer pressure that is actually very much at work within the academy and even at work within peer review. So once ideas become official and become the consensus view that you're expected to hold to as an academic, it becomes very hard for you as a rising academic, as someone who's getting your credentials, to speak against or critique these orthodox views, because you're pushing against the very people whose approval you need to advance in your career. And therefore, you tend to conform. And so that's how you get the academy being maybe more like an echo chamber than being a home for free thinkers who are all trying to understand things and all open to new ideas. It just simply doesn't work out that way. The academy is a very human place, and you find these unhelpful human dynamics very much at work within the academy. So if this is the correct view, it reminds me of a certain children's story about a naked emperor, right? Because you have all the people who are concerned about how they are perceived, participating in the perpetuating of a lie, and it takes someone who isn't so concerned about how he or she is perceived to point out that that's what's going on and to speak the truth. And in this case, it's a very common sense truth, and it's a very obvious truth. That guy is not wearing any clothes. So David mentioned a more recent book, a book that just came out last month, in fact, October 13th, that I've co-authored with Jay Richards and William Briggs. It's called The Price of Panic: How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. I'm not going to be talking about this book, but I wanted to point out the connection between this book and Undeniable. And it really is this idea of the tyranny of experts. This unhelpful but true fact that people with credentials, if the masses are happy to have experts elevated and listen to the experts uncritically, we get ourselves into trouble, because you end up with a few people who are pushing their view of reality onto everyone else, and everyone else being compelled to accept their view, despite the fact that their view might be in tension with common sense, or might even seem ridiculous to people who have a very commonsensical view of the world. Common sense does not have the status that expertise does within the academy. And if we go this way, allowing experts to run the show, then we end up with something like tyranny happening here. I think that's what's happened with the coronavirus, and more specifically with the response, virtually global response that has been informed by experts without listening very well to common sense. And that parallels very much what's happened in biology with this subject of origins. There's a commonsensical view in both of these cases that has a lot to it, a lot of merit, and needs to be taken very seriously even by the experts. And often the experts do not take those commonsensical views very seriously. To that point, And the idea of the way, notice how science is thrown about in both of these areas. So people who want a certain view of the pandemic response to be supported will say, this is the scientific view. The science says this. You hear this a lot these days. And rarely is the science so simple or so univocal. Science really is about dialogue, about debate, and about different ideas clashing and bringing evidence to the clash and making different cases. And it can take a long time before the truth emerges through these different ideas being put out there and argued for. It's not about settling the matter with the pound of a fist to the table and saying, science says this, we don't want to hear any other view. Science just doesn't operate that way. This paper came out a short time ago by people from Claremont McKenna College down here in Southern California and Harvey Mudd that coined this wonderful term that I hope becomes very well used. The term is a Castro consensus, referring to Fidel Castro, the now deceased prior leader of Cuba, who ruled with an iron fist. And of course, when someone rules that way and they have the military to back them up, few people have the backbone to disagree with them. So you can get a consensus that's really more, it's more a peer pressure consensus or a forced consensus than anything else. And a consensus of that kind really does not inform us as to what's true at all. It just simply tells us that there's power behind this position, so you better think twice before you disagree with it. Okay, so here's a quote from that paper. A consensus can only be trusted to the extent that individuals are free to disagree with it. And that's an obvious point, but an important one, that when people talk about scientific consensus, you need to ask, is this a scientific consensus against which scientists are freely able to disagree? Or is this a consensus that scientists are freely able to push against and they suffer no harmful consequences to their career? Or is this the sort of consensus that Castro had, where you circle the wagons and you punish anyone who disagrees? And in fact, science is not a consensus discipline. It's not a democracy. Science is about the truth reigning and all people, hopefully with some humility, recognizing that even the best experiments and the best theories only hope to take us in the direction of truth. They never settle the matter finally. We always need to be open to ideas being challenged. So it's not a consensus discipline. Anything but that. Okay, so I'm going to give two arguments that are both attached to this common sense view. And these are both arguments against what we could call the naturalist or the materialist view of reality. So naturalism is the idea that nature is all that there is and everything else came out of nature, including the notion of God. It's God only appeared in our human thinking when we evolved to a point where we invented him as a, presumably, the Darwinist would say, with some survival benefit to organizing society around certain ways of living. It became beneficial for us to appeal to a omniscient authority who sees all that we do. And therefore, humans invented God, and this is part of an evolutionary process that started way back with the origin of life. That's the naturalist or materialist view. You could call it the physicalist view, to the extent that people believe that there is nothing other than the physical universe and its parts, that atoms and molecules, space and time are the only things that exist, only the stuff that physicists study, and everything else just came out of physics, including again, our notions of God. Well, I'm going to give you two simple, or at least I'm going to present a simple version of them, and they actually can be pleasantly complex, but they're simple and can be understood in a commonsensical way. And they're powerful because of that. I'm going to argue that a lot of their power comes from their simplicity and their common sense nature. Two arguments against the naturalist, materialist, physicalist view. One of them I'm going to call the argument from introspection. So when we look at ourselves as humans and think about how we tick, there's a way to show that we cannot be just atoms and molecules. And the second argument is going to be an argument from observation of the outside world. So one of them is looking in and the other one is looking out. So this first one, argument from introspection, it goes like this. We're going to start as thinking humans, thinking about reflecting introspectively on what it is that we're doing when we think. And an important observation is that humans cannot reason apart from some bedrock assumptions, taking some things to be true that we cannot show to be true. So we take them to be true on faith. And the first of these is the idea that human thought is a valid exercise, that it's appropriate and not wholly misguided for us to think at all. Okay, so we're not saying here that all humans are great thinkers, and we're not saying that all human thoughts are true, not at all. We're simply saying that the exercise of thinking is valid in that if and when done carefully, we can hope to get at the truth. So it's not a complete waste of time for humans to think. And it turns out we have to take this to be true by faith. We cannot show through thinking that thinking is valid, because if thinking is not valid, then our demonstration is of no use whatsoever. We have to take this to be true on faith and just trust that it's true and proceed on that faith basis. We assume that it's true. We take that to be true on faith. Nothing thereafter can prove that we are right to take it on faith, because everything thereafter depends on the quality of our thinking. And that is the very thing that we have to take on faith, right? So this is something we take to be true entirely on faith. We have no way to prove it. And we take this to be true for all of the reasoning that we do. When we do take it to be true, and all of us, by the way, naturally, commonsensically do take this to be true. So it's only after we've studied philosophy probably quite extensively would we ever come back and sort of critique this question of the validity of human thought. Naturally, we do take it to be true. And having taken it to be true, but we're still doing this on faith, we have no way to prove it, that opens the door for us to start doing science. But there's something else we have to take to be true to do science. And that is not just, is it a legitimate exercise for humans to think, but is the world out there that we are thinking about, if we're doing this thing we call science, is it really out there? And does it really have objective properties such that I can observe it and think about it and describe my conclusions to you, and you can go out and observe the same objective outside world and think about it, and you can make sense of what I said or critique what I said, and we can go back and forth, and we can make sense in our dialogue because we're both observing something that's really out there, that's independent of our thoughts, right? Here again, there is no experiment you can do with test tubes that shows that the outside world is real, because if it's not real, your test tubes aren't real. There's no way to get out of this. You have to take on faith that human thought is a valid exercise, and you have to take on faith that there is an objective world out there. And once you do that, you can do science. But science cannot demonstrate that this assumption is correct. This is something you have to take to be true on faith. And all scientists do this. Most of them do not do it reflectively. They just sort of, they move past this and assume that science is, a lot of them assume that science is the only path to truth. And that's not true. And this is a proof that faith is required to do science. So once we have taken these things to be true on faith, we are in a position to start offering explanations of the natural world, observations lead to conclusions, refining of theories, and we think we know how things work. And this is really what we're doing when we do science. We're trying to come up with explanations of how the natural world operates. Now, I want to show a special case here that turns out to be very informative. And that is, let's consider whether there might be a particular explanation that came out of this scientific activity, the scientific process, and we think we now understand something about the natural world, and we're going to call it a scientific explanation, and we're going to put it in textbooks and teach it to people. It turns out there's a special class of these explanations that is self-defeating. And I'm going to show you how it's self-defeating, and I'm going to show you that physicalism, the idea that there is nothing but the physical universe, is precisely one of these self-defeating, supposedly scientific explanations. It works like this. If you have an explanation that you think is scientific, that if taken seriously has implications for our faith in human thinking and our faith in science, and those implications are negative. In other words, if this supposedly scientific explanation should undercut our confidence in the validity of thinking as a human exercise, then it also undermines, undercuts, eliminates our confidence in science, and then it also undercuts, eliminates our confidence in the explanation itself. So if there are examples of this, and I'm going to show you that there are, these would be self-defeating explanations, because if you take them seriously, it forces you to go back and revise your faith position and ultimately undercut the explanation itself. It's one of these things where if you suppose it's true and you think carefully, you end up concluding that it's not true, okay? It's a self-defeating proposition. Now, I had a wonderful, one of my best teachers, probably my best teacher, was my 8th grade math teacher, who one day puzzled us in class and asked us the question that seemed very philosophical, and we couldn't figure out what he was getting at. He asked us, where are numbers? And we started by saying, well, they're in our textbook, or they're on the blackboard. This is back in the days when you used chalk to write on a blackboard. And he said, no. He said, those are numerals, which are not the same as numbers. These are symbols by which we represent numbers, but they're not numbers. Where do numbers live? Where are numbers? And we were very puzzled by the question. We couldn't figure out what he was getting at. One girl, after it seemed like 10 or 15 minutes of this, it may not have been quite that long, said, well, they're in our heads. And he said, yes, numbers are in our heads. What he was getting at, I think, and I'm going to argue, is not that they're in our heads, but that they're in our minds, right? The world of numbers is a concept world, and it exists in an immaterial world of mental experience and mental activity. And here's how we can show that that's the only coherent way to view things. I have in my book, Undeniable, an illustration where I ask the reader to imagine going into a brain imaging lab and having all kinds of equipment, probes attached to the scalp. And I ask the reader to pretend this is a futuristic imaging lab where they can do things in this lab that they can't do actually in a true brain imaging lab. Let's suppose that in this lab they have the highest futuristic technology. They can watch and examine and put up on displays that are all around you in this laboratory absolutely everything that is happening within your brain in real time. So as you're thinking or dialoguing with a scientist, they can be watching all the neural activity in your brain and imaging it and putting things up on displays that show what's happening. And let's suppose that these scientists who are running this lab are materialists, they're physicalists. They think that your mind doesn't exist, or it's something that's sort of an epiphenomenon of the brain, but everything real and everything about you is actually physical in nature. And so your thinking is happening right here in your brain. If it's not happening here, then it's not happening at all because nothing else exists from this worldview. And these scientists are asking you to count to 10 and to kind of think about these numbers as you're counting. And they freeze the screen when you get to the number 2. And they show this image, and it's got the frontal lobe lit up here in red. And they say, is this what you mean when you say that word two, TWO? Is this what you mean by two? And of course, you chuckle a bit. You can't believe they're serious, but they are serious. And you say, no, that's not what I mean when I say two. And you say, I'm not denying that maybe my frontal lobe lights up like this when I say two, but that's not what I mean when I say two. And so they zero in more detail, and they show specific synaptic junctions here and neurons, and they point to a particular synapse that fired here in yellow and say, this fired precisely when you were uttering that word TWO, two. Is this what you mean when you say that word two? And again, you think that it's a humorous question, and you say, that's not at all what I mean when I say two. And again, you're not denying that this synapse fired. You're not denying that your brain is active when you're thinking of the numbers. You're just saying, this isn't what I mean by two. And nothing like this is what I mean by two. And at this point, the scientists get perturbed, and they're saying, there is nothing to you but these cells and their physical constituents, and there's nothing to your thinking other than what's happening here that we are imaging in real time. So if this is not what you mean by two, then you don't mean anything. There can't be a meaning to two because it has to be here in your brain. And that's the view that they hold, that everything is physical, and that would include absolutely everything, including the meaning of the words that you're using. And here we have precisely the sort of self-defeating position that supposedly came out of a scientific view that ends up being more of a philosophical view and a problematic philosophical view. Because if you were to take these scientists seriously, or move in the direction of taking them seriously, you would have a problem. Because if what they're saying is the meaning of every word you utter has to be a physical brain thing, then what they're saying is you don't know what you're meaning. When you don't know what you mean with every word that you're using. You're confused, in other words, about the meaning of the very words that you're uttering. Every time you utter a word, every time you utter a sentence, you're fundamentally confused about what you're meaning, because you think you're meaning non-physical things. You think you're talking about ideas when you talk about math and all kinds of other things, but you're not. Those things don't exist. You have to be meaning something here. You insist that you're not. And it's that contradiction between what they're insisting you must mean and what you, through introspection, say, I don't mean that. So if I take you seriously, I have to conclude that I'm fundamentally and deeply confused, because what I think I'm doing when I'm thinking, you're telling me I can't be doing, and that means I can't actually be thinking. So I am pressed, or you are pressed in this situation, to accept one of two propositions. Either the world is the way I think it is, and I am manipulating concepts which are non-physical when I think, or you guys, the brain imaging scientists, are right, and I am being manipulated by neurons. I'm being made to think, I'm being tricked into having an impression that something is going on when I'm thinking that isn't actually going on. But if it's B, then you have this self-destruction. Because if I'm fundamentally confused, then I've lost all confidence in the validity of human thought. I've lost all confidence in the validity of science. And I've lost all confidence in your view that you say is scientific of how the brain operates and how humans operate, because all of it is predicated on these faith positions that you've now undercut. So this is a profoundly self-defeating view. And because it's self-defeating, we are right to reject it. And we land on this of the two options. I am manipulating concepts. They are non-physical, but that's what I'm doing because that's the only way I can have a coherent view of my experience. So we have a world, and I'm saying world here, meaning all of reality. All of reality looks like this. There is a physical realm, there is a physical world. We're not denying that, but there has to be an immaterial, non-physical realm where we are doing our thinking. Our ideas have to be real. They have to be up here in a realm that is not atoms and molecules. It's not on the periodic table. And in human beings, there has to be this sort of interface where, yes, things that affect my brain are going to affect my ability to think, and vice versa. The things that I think affect the activity of my brain, and that's how we move our bodies. We think things, and then our body responds. But the two realms have to be distinct. They have to be different. This cannot be physical. The moment you try to make this physical, it all disappears in a puff of smoke. Okay, that is the argument against materialism, physicalism through introspection. We're going to now just change gears and look at a completely different argument. I wanted to give you two, though, and two that are commonsensical, where you don't need a PhD to use these, because the fact that you can have multiple arguments, commonsensical arguments that come to the same conclusion, which is the physicalist view of reality and particularly of humanity cannot be true, that gives us some confidence that there's something here, and that those 4-year-olds are actually maybe right when they see the butterfly and they intuit with no teaching. They weren't taught to do it. They just intuit that was made by a godlike designer. Okay, I'm keeping track of the time. I'm going to try to end in time for us to have questions here at the end. This ends up being an argument from coincidence. And coincidence is an interesting thing because from an early age, we seem to have a sense of coincidence. And by that, I mean, we have a sense when we look at circumstances for circumstances that could not have just happened by chance. Someone had to have done them. And the reason I think this emerges very early on in humans is that from a very early age, maybe 1 year of age, humans are already looking at things with an aim to knowing how to do things, right? They want to be able to do what big brother, big sister, mom and dad do. And the early stage of that is recognizing things that required know-how in order to do. And then a developing human, a young child, is wanting to have that know-how, right? So that we're constantly from very early age wanting to learn so that we can do these things that require know-how. And part of that learning is simply recognizing the things that require know-how. And that comes down to recognizing things that couldn't have been done except through know-how, which means it's a recognition of coincidence. Specifically, it's a recognition of some things being beyond coincidence, or they would be unbelievable, they would be spooky coincidences, so we don't explain them that way. I'm not saying that a 2-year-old has this vocabulary or thinks about things in this sort of structured way, but something like this is going on even in a very young child or developing. So let's talk a little bit about coincidence and how it is that we immediately spot things that can't be coincidence. And the converse of that is we're comfortable with calling certain things coincidences. We're very uncomfortable with calling other things coincidences. So imagine that a friend crumples up a piece of red paper and throws it on a table, and it looks like this, crumpled. Now, I could convince you that I can see the head of an elephant here. And once I say this, you probably say, okay, I can see how you can see that. You have these sort of large ears, you have something that looks a little bit trunk-like, and you have the rough shape of something that could be likened to the head of an elephant. And yet, if this actually happened and we saw this piece of paper, we wouldn't find this to be beyond coincidence, right? Because you can crumple up paper and find some sort of shape that you superimpose on it. And we recognize that really we're doing most of the work to say that this is like an elephant. The crumpling of the paper didn't really do much. We're having to sort of superimpose our picture upon it. Contrast that with say a 4-year-old coming to the same table and seeing this on the table instead, made out of red paper. Here, even if the 4-year-old has never heard of origami, has never experienced someone shaping paper like this, he or she knows immediately that someone who knew what they were doing had to have done this, because they see in this form of the paper something that shows all the hallmarks of know-how. Someone did something careful here. Someone did something remarkable to this paper, and this is precisely the sort of thing that the 4-year-old then wants to know how it was done. I use another way to talk about coincidence and how it works and our sense of it. I use alphabet soup for this. I don't remember whether you have this in the UK, but it's usually children in the US. It's something that you can buy in the US. So you have the alphabet in pasta letters and sometimes numbers in soup. And obviously, if you give a child this or someone that's reading age, they like to play around with it and see if it spells things or maybe move the letters around and spell things. But if someone just poured this into a bowl, you would expect to be able, by sheer coincidence, to find arrangements of letters that you could say, this happens to be a short word. And they'll have all the hallmarks of coincidence because they'll be short words. You won't find a sentence spelled out in alphabet soup. And they'll tend to be somewhat messy. So you, again, as with the elephant head, you have to do a little bit of work to find them. So there's C in alphabet soup by coincidence. We're very content with that to be coincidence. May, you can find longer words like rose. But there again, you have to do work because you have to, the letters are messy, they're upside down, and you have to kind of follow a path that's not straightforward in order to see these things. And so we're very happy to say, yes, these happen by coincidence. Now, imagine, however, that you were to lift the lid on a pot of alphabet soup and to see this. Here, and this could be a child who sees this, a 5-year-old sees this in their bowl of alphabet soup. Here, we know right away this didn't just happen. No one could have just poured the soup out and got it arranged like this. And the reason we know that is it shows signs of know-how. Someone deliberately cleared away pasta and deliberately aligned these 5 letters to spell a word. And if that's true for a 5-letter word, if we know that this would only happen if someone arranged it, that it couldn't happen by chance, it would be much more true of something like this, right? Something that has much more content to it. There's no way that something like this will happen by chance. Now, and we've said, or I'm saying, that the 4-year-old gets this the same way that the 4-year-old gets the butterfly. But we could ask, and of course people do ask, well, is the 4-year-old right or wrong? And Alison Gopnik thought the 4-year-old was wrong. Is there a way to show, technically, probabilistically, that the 4-year-old is actually right, or that we're right when we say this can't happen by chance? There is a way to do this, and it's not very complicated, but it involves simple probabilistic calculation. And that is to put a grid of squares over this picture, where the grid squares are about the size of the letters, and to consider how improbable. So here we have 3 by 7 is 20, 21 plus 2 is 23 grid squares that are unusual. These you have the 5 of the 23 that are very unusual in that they have the letters. And then you have the 18 of the 23 that are less unusual, but still noticeably unusual, and that that the letters have been cleared away to provide clear space that makes the 5 spelling out the word pop in the middle. All we have to do is ask ourselves, how unusual in terms of improbable are these 18 squares, and how unusual are the 5 in the middle, in order to ask, well, how unusual would this whole thing be? How unlikely would it be to pour a bowl of alphabet soup and have something like this happen by chance? If we take these cleared squares to be about 1 in 10 unusual, and they're probably more unusual than that if you look at the rest of the surface of the soup, and we take these with the letters because they're arranged just right, they're in the right orientation, to be more like 1 in 100 unusual, and they're the right letters to spell a word, then we have something like this: 18 squares that are 1 in 10 unusual, 5 in the middle are 1 in 100 unusual. And that means that the whole thing taken together is this unusual. 1 in 10 to the 18th power, because those are the 18 1 in 10 squares, times 100 to the 5th power. These are the 5 central 1 in 100 squares raised to the 5th power, because there's 5 of them. And if you multiply this out, it is this. The whole pattern is 1 in 10 octillion unusual, which means by this simple calculation, it doesn't matter if we're off a little bit here, it's rough, but it gives a very clear conclusion. We would need to pour about 10 octillion bowls of alphabet soup in order for this, something like this, to happen. And of course, no one will ever do that. There's not, if you filled all the C's with alphabet soup, you would not have nearly this amount. This will never happen, which validates our intuition. We used a calculator to get it, but we didn't need it when we first saw this. We knew someone did that. And now we have a mathematical result that says, yes, we were right to conclude that someone had to have done that. It's really the same reasoning that allowed the 4-year-old to know that that origami crane was done deliberately and was not a product of accidental causes, because again, there's so many things that have to be arranged correctly in a coordinated way to get to the crane, 20 or so steps, all of them having been done quite meticulously before this comes out at the end. There's no way that accidental bending or folding or crumpling of paper would do this. There's too much to it. There's too much know-how involved. Again, we could go through a calculation and validate our immediate, instantaneous common sense conclusion that someone had to make the crane, but we don't need to do a calculation, because once you've done a couple of these calculations, you realize there's something that we're seeing here immediately that doesn't even need a calculator. It's just so obviously true. I describe that thing that we're seeing. I use the term invention to describe the thing that the 4-year-old is seeing in the origami crane, or that we're seeing when we see a text message or a paragraph, or even a word spelled out in alphabet soup. We're seeing an invention. An invention could be, a patentable, complex technical thing. Those are inventions, but I'm using the word more generally to mean anything where someone conceived of something and constructed it in order to perform a high-level function. And that could be as simple as a text message. There's something you want to communicate, you type the letters to get the text message, you're arranging things in order to accomplish something functional. Here's a figure from Undeniable that illustrates this sort of hierarchy of structure you always have when you have an invention. And it has a property that I call in the book functional coherence. And that all I mean by this is whenever you have a high-level function, an invention, you have a top-level thing that is only able to do its clever high-level function because of layers and layers of smaller things that are precisely arranged in order to support that top-level function, okay? So in the case of a text message or a paragraph, the top-level thing is the meaning you're trying to convey. For a paragraph, below the level of the whole paragraph, you have sentences that are what they are and have been written the way they are in order for the paragraph to work. And you have phrases and words within the sentences that are what they are and are arranged the way they are in order for the sentences to work, all the way down to the letters of the alphabet down here, right? So everything is in its place in this hierarchy in order for this top-level function to be performed. And because you have to know what you're doing through all of these steps in order to write a paragraph, you have to know how to spell, you have to know how to structure sentences, you have to know grammar. Know-how is required at every point of this hierarchy, which means, as with the spelling out of pasta, which is a very small amount of functional coherence, these things are always fantastically rare. They're fantastically improbable, really impossible to come about by chance. They only come about when someone who knew what they were doing arranged these things in order for this to come about. And that's precisely why we don't need a calculator. When we see the high-level function, we know that someone knew what they were doing, and we also know that chance can never replicate that. So all you need to do with respect to a digital camera is see that it does something, namely you click it, and then an image of what you were pointing it at appears on the back of it. And you know that this is an example of functional coherence. You know that nothing like this could happen by chance. You don't need to take it apart to see that it has hundreds of parts that are all arranged in this hierarchy that I showed here in this image to know that that has to be the case. Yeah, I mean, you can take it apart and you see that it is the case. And if this is true of something as simple, it's complex, but relative to life, this is very simple. If this principle is true, that you don't need to take it apart to know that it has to have all these parts and they have to be cleverly arranged, that's true for a digital camera. It is much more true for things like this, okay? It's true for the human body, which is physical, and it's even more true than for the entire human, which has a non-physical component and a physical component, as we've just argued. So way beyond the camera, I mean, this looks as complex as that camera diagram if we look at just the organ level complexity of a human body. But what distinguishes biological complexity from human technology is you can drill in on any one of these organs and find layer upon layer upon layer of complexity as you get down to smaller and smaller layers. So for the eyes, the eye is one organ, but it is composed of tissues, many tissues that are arranged just so in order for it to work. Each of those tissues has its own complex structure to it. So the retina consists of these rod and cone cells, and every one of these cells has its own internal complex structure. And you have cellular organelles, you have the complex structure of all of these cells. And then you can drill down even further, all the way down to the molecular level. So down here, you continue to see extraordinary complexity that allows things to function the way they function. This is a very complex enzyme called the ribosome, which has RNA components and protein components. It's the enzyme that is responsible for taking genetic message, a genetic sequence that comes from a gene, and using that, reading that, translating that into a sequence of amino acids for building a protein. So the very protein components that are part of this, on a molecular scale, this is a massive complex. Obviously, since it's a molecule, it's very tiny too. So it's submicroscopic, but massive in terms of molecular structures. And the very components that are proteins were made by other ribosomes. So this is the protein making machinery of the cell. This is what I devoted myself to when I started to tackle this question at the molecular level. I was very interested in how hard or easy it is to get genetic instructions in DNA. So how hard is it to arrange A's, C's, G's, and T's? Those are the 4 letters of DNA in order to get one of these chains of amino acids, and now there are 20 amino acids. So you have to go through a clever conversion. It's called the genetic code to get from a written language of 4 letters to a language of 20 letters. Those are the amino acids. And as with alphabetic sequences, if you just throw letters together at random, you'll have gibberish, but these are not gibberish. The natural protein structures you find in life are very special sequences that have extraordinary properties that allow them to collapse into 3-dimensional structures that actually perform functions. And it turns out, if you just throw amino acids together randomly, you'll not get anything structured like this. You'll have something flopping around that will get chewed up within the cell. To get the sorts of structures you need for life to work, you need extraordinary sequences in the DNA. You need genetic information that tells the cell how to arrange these amino acids so that they do form the right structures to perform the needed functions. Well, when I was in Cambridge, working in Cambridge, I looked at this particular enzyme. This is called beta lactamase. It's the enzyme that is used within bacteria to allow them to survive in the presence of a penicillin antibiotic. So this is a clinical nightmare for us humans, but it's wonderful if you're a bacterium and don't want to die in the presence of penicillin. What I did in a nutshell, and I'll just very briefly get to the bottom line here so that we have some time for questions, is I introduced random changes within clusters of amino acids within this enzyme. And then I put these libraries of randomized genes into bacterial cells and then plated these cells on Petri dishes that had a little bit of penicillin. And by doing that, I could find out which of these shuffled versions still worked. Because if it didn't work, if this enzyme was not still able to chew up penicillin, here's penicillin is shown here in green. So what this does is when it's working properly, it chews up the penicillin and allows the bacteria to survive. Only if it was still working after I shuffled it, would it still do that trick and allow the bacteria to form a colony on the Petri dish in the presence of a small amount of penicillin. If this didn't work, if I'd broken it, then the bacterial cell placed on the Petri dish would not form a colony because it would succumb to the penicillin. It would be killed by the penicillin. So that allowed me, with this sort of experiment, to actually count the numbers that come through. So if I throw a bunch of mutant versions of this and they've got mutations within a clustered region of the enzyme, if I make, say, 200,000 of these and put them out on these test plates and I count how many form colonies, then I've got a fraction of the total that still work. And they prove that they still work by making colonies. And to the extent that they don't make colonies, they don't work. By doing this in several locations throughout the enzyme, I was able to get an estimate of the fraction of amino acid sequences that fold to something that can work like this if you had shuffled the entire thing. And I couldn't shuffle the entire thing because if I did, I wouldn't get anything coming through. But I could use the numbers from more modest shuffling to come up with a calculation to calculate what would happen if I had shuffled the whole thing. And you can think of this was published back in 2004 in this paper that came out in the Journal of Molecular Biology. It poses a problem for Darwinism, which I only sort of hinted at in the paper because I wanted the paper to be accepted. And the more pugnacious the paper, the more likely I would run into problems with peer review. But this paper publishes a value, a probability, and the probability is down here at the bottom, 1 in 10 to the 77th power. So that's like 1 in a trillion, meaning if we want to appeal to chance to solve this problem of making a folded protein, we're really appealing to chance to hit a very small target, 1 part in a trillion. And that's almost unimaginably small. That would be like hitting a target the size of a hydrogen atom on a space the size of a spherical shell enclosing the entire visible universe. Imagine something unimaginably large like that has a bullseye on it the size of this, a hydrogen atom, and claiming that a chance process happened to hit that bullseye, not just once, but thousands and tens of thousands of times. That just can't happen. Now, being a biologist, I know that if you describe this result to people who believe that evolution works, they'll have all kinds of technical objections. They'll think it's too simple to dismiss Darwinism, and they'll bring all kinds of technical embellishments of the Darwinian theory up, and all kinds of they'll name all kinds of papers that haven't been cited in order to make this argument, and they'll be suspicious of it because I'm trying to use a simple argument to show that a very complex theory doesn't in fact work. We're backing up the way the 4-year-old does and saying that emperor is not wearing any clothes, and people don't really like it when they spend a lot of time on a theory if you say that there's a simple sense in which it can't be true. So I know that people object to it, but what I'm saying is the simple truth, the simple reasoning here is so unassailable and so correct that none of these objections actually hold water. You can think about it this way. What we're saying in the end is if we take these two causal categories, one is chance, and you can lump physics and chance together here, unplanned, blind material processes are so unlike genius, creative genius, that there's really no connection. These are like polar opposites. This is not genius. This is not chance. And we know this from our own experience. So considering that there's no connection between these, really the only way for this cause, the one on the left, the chance here, I'm still assuming you can see my pointer, but I'll try to make it clear anyway. The only way that chance can do the work of genius is if it has a number of opportunities that approaches the inverse of the improbability, right? So can chance solve a 1 in a million problem? Yes, it can if you give it a million chances. It's very hard for it to solve a 1 in a million problem in one chance. Specifically, it's 1 in a million hard. What about 1 in a billion, 1 in a trillion? Well, as you continue to make this probability more extreme, improbability more extreme, you put more and more demands on the opportunities that would be needed for chance to be a plausible explanation. And when you get to astronomical, beyond astronomical numbers, like this 1 in 10 to the 77th power, you've really reached a point where there's no way that chance can do this. There just aren't enough opportunities there. In life, this is really an upper bound for the number of opportunities for something to happen and be selected. The upper bound is given by the most prolific form of life on the planet, right? And the most prolific form of life on the planet happens to be the cyanobacterium. So this is a bacterial form that can do photosynthesis and live just with sunlight, air, and water and minerals. It doesn't need the rest of us. It can do just fine. If you look at the standing population of these organisms, it's about 10 to the 27, 1,000 trillion of them out there in various natural waters. And if you estimate that they go through about a generation every day, so 365 generations per year, and that the age of the species, will take the classic textbook age of these species, of this life form, to be about 1 billion years, then the total number of cyanobacterial cells that have ever existed on the planet turns out to be about 10 to the 38th power. But that is so far short of 10 to the 77th power that there's no way a single protein fold could have been found by stumbling upon it in an organism that is only given that number of opportunities. In other words, the opportunities do not approach, they don't even come close to the number they would need to be in order for this chance explanation to be valid. And there is no other way for chance to work. The only way for it to work, the only way, given the disconnect between these two things, the only way for chance to work is for it to be given a number of opportunities that is sufficient for it to work. And I'm saying it doesn't have that number of opportunities. Moreover, I'm going to say what I'm saying is not even controversial in that point. This is a quote from Richard Dawkins from The Blind Watchmaker, which I think was his finest work in defense of Darwinism. He got a little bit gritchy after this work. But here, writing in 1986, he really believed he had a strong case to be made. And he says this in that book: however many ways there may be of being alive, it is certain that there are vastly more ways of being dead, or rather not alive. You may throw cells together at random over and over again for 1 billion years, and not once will you get a conglomeration that flies or swims or burrows or runs or does anything even badly that could remotely be construed as working to keep itself alive. Now, he thinks the solution to this is natural selection, but he doesn't seem to realize that he's proven that that's false in this very statement, because natural selection only happens when something does work to keep the organism alive. And here he's saying that in billions and billions of opportunities, you don't have nearly enough to come up with an arrangement that does something clever. So he's acknowledging what we're saying here, that billions of years is not nearly enough to overcome this improbability, which means this chance explanation on the left here, which he would like to say works, it doesn't work. And his own reasoning shows that it doesn't work. The bottom line then, when you're looking at something that is this improbable, coincidence can be safely ruled out. That's exactly what the four-year-old does. And we can safely affirm that genius is the only way that a formerly lifeless planet with all of its physical resources can possibly have come to be populated by such complex things. I will leave it at that. I'm sorry, I think I went a little bit over, but hopefully we have some time that we can have some dialogue and discussion. And I'll stop sharing and I can always restart sharing, right? If I need to.
Doug, thank you ever so much. It was a great talk. Really enjoyed it. Can I kick off with just on that last point of opportunities and chance? I'll round some figures up so that it's more simple. If there's let's say there's a 1 in a billion chance of something happening.
Yeah.
I'll give it a specific example. Say it's winning the lottery. It doesn't mean though, does it, that I have to do the lottery 1 billion times before I would win it. So isn't there a chance that even though you've quoted these high figures, you could still get there in a lot less opportunities?
There is, and that's obviously true. It means that if you wanted to reliably win the lottery, you'd have to spend more money than you want to spend on lottery tickets. So if it's 1 in a billion, usually they're a little better than that. But if it were 1 in a billion for a particular lottery game and you wanted to win it reliably, so if I said next week I'm going to win the lottery, I'd have to be prepared to spend £1 billion or whatever your lottery tickets cost, which I think would be a very poor investment. But if you wanted to get there reliably, that's what you'd have to do. So can you say, yeah, but could a person, you've heard the story, some person just buys one lottery ticket and they win the jackpot on their first ticket. Is that possible? It is possible in the case of 1 in a billion odds. It is not expected. So in the case of Darwinism, we have to not just solve a 1 in 10 to the 77 problem. We have to solve a much bigger problem over and over and over and over again. So if a Darwinist wants to take refuge in the fact that it's not, that the probability is not 0, it's just extraordinarily small, what they're saying is there's no way that evolution should work. So the theory does not explain life, but maybe it just got lucky. And no one wants to say that because then it becomes a non-scientific explanation. So Darwin, to the extent that Darwin's theory is an explanation of how life came to be, it has to say that it is expected, that we would expect a lifeless planet to become populated with complex life given this mechanism. And that is not saying that it could happen even though the odds are extraordinarily against it. The way I bring more clarity to this in my book is really, if you have 6-7 billion people on a planet, a 1 in a billion thing is not really all that improbable. It will happen somewhere if 1 billion people are kind of sampling space. And in a country with 60-some million as the UK or 300-some million in the US, or a state with so many millions, if the odds are 1 in 50 million of winning the lottery, and you have 20 million people playing it, and some of them are playing it way more than they should, you'll get your winner. It'll happen because there's enough of this is happening. There's a difference between it happening and it happening here and now. I need it to happen now. And that is the difference between an improbable event happening somewhere versus a specified improbable event happening here where I need it to happen. And if you need to win the lottery, yes, you're going to have to spend your 60 million or 100 million or $1 billion But if we just say, well, someone will win, yeah, that's out there, but it's not going to help if I need to get rare events happening right here. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's great. Can I move it on to a different topic? There was a quote.
Yeah.
I meant to write it down. I'm going to have to get it from your slides, I think. It was a great quote about, I haven't got the words of it, but you can correct me, consensus.
You want me to, I can share my screen.
Well, it was along the lines of consensus is only valuable to the extent people are allowed to disagree. It was something like that.
Yeah.
In your experience, to what extent can people in the scientific community disagree?
On non-controversial subjects, there's quite a bit of freedom to disagree. On subjects that the general populace doesn't even know are controversial, they become controversial. You get, aside from political controversy, which we have in, or ideological controversy, which we have in spades on origins, and we have with coronavirus, you have something that's more like turf war, protectionism in science. So in any field of science, you have a bunch of people who are really competing with each other for limited funds to do their work. And you'll get these ideas that are promoted by the people who framed them. And when they're promoting their ideas, one of the things they're doing is they're trying to train up young scientists to think the way they think. They're not always wrong, but this is just the way humans operate. You'll invariably end up with these sort of turf wars where there's a competition among various interpretations within this very, very detailed, specific field. And people who are kind of the owners of idea one don't want idea two to gain traction. And this plays itself out in unpleasant ways in peer review. So if you're in camp one and you write a paper, you really want it to go to peer review with camp one reviewers, not camp two reviewers, because they don't like camp one. And this sort of, it seems childish, but this is the way humans operate. And it definitely happens this way within the sciences. Again, as I said, science isn't properly conceived. It's not supposed to be about consensus. So, and there are examples where, in fact, all the examples of a truly brilliant idea sweeping away the nonsense that came before it, they start off with a very much non-consensus view. When Einstein was conceiving of general relativity and special relativity, that was not at all a consensus view. And a lot of people would have thought it sounds crazy. But eventually, because his math was so compelling, he eventually wins the day. And I'm sure there were people around his age who never did buy general relativity. They die off, and you get another generation of physicists who come up and they're convinced. So that's really the way it works kind of behind the scenes. David, did you have a question?
Yeah, I think David Galloway wants to make a point.
Yeah, so Doug, fascinating presentation. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, you bet.
It just seems to me that the argument that you presented to us is so persuasive to really torpedo the physicalist position. Why is it you think that the scientific community, the wider scientific community, just falls so heavily on one side of the argument and seem to avoid the implications of this so resolutely that they're not prepared to even entertain the prospect of agreeing such that the consensus is protected?
It's a great question. The only explanation I have is that people recognize immediately that there are worldview implications of certain arguments. And it's not that they have an answer to the argument. In fact, they may know deep down that they don't have an answer. And deep down, they might think, actually, I'm bothered by how persuasive that is, but they just don't want to go that way. And so I don't think it's true that entire scientific fields are, committed to something, or at least not all the scientists within a field. I would not say that all biologists are materialists, because I know they're not. I would not say that all chemists or physicists are atheists, because I know they're not. But instead, they find themselves trying to exist and thrive within a discipline that has become, in an unhealthy way, controlled by these worldviews. Even though not all of the participants hold the worldview, they're all, to some extent, touched by the worldview in that if they misbehave, that is, if they do work that pushes up against one of these sort of sacrosanct views, they'll get punished. Yeah. And the different disciplines have, the power structure is such that they do have ways to punish. They can deprive you of tenure, they can deprive you of publications, they can deprive you of grant revenue, and very quickly either whip you into shape or dismiss you as a crackpot and show you the back door.
Let me just have a quick follow-up, David, if I may, because some of the listeners might well have connected with Mike Behe's presentation and interview with John West, which was broadcast on Saturday last to coincide with the production of Mike's book, A Mousetrap for Darwin, where some of these same ideas are elaborated to some extent. And I was keen to ask Mike, there's no doubt that his professional colleagues in his university department distance themselves from some of the views that he has gone public with. And I was keen to know, just in private conversations with his colleagues, just whether or not they gained any traction. What's been your experience, Doug, in just connecting with colleagues with whom you're working, either in the lab or in the academy more widely? I mean, in a private moment, are they prepared to sit down and really recognize that you've got some decent arguments here?
Yes, and that was definitely true 20 years ago, 15 years ago. 15 years ago, we could have, a talk in a pub, and you'd get someone who's not prepared to go the way of intelligent design, who would say, that's not the way I want to go, but I have to admit, you've got a good argument there. And I had conversations just like this, both in the US and in the UK.
Yeah.
What happens then? There's a very memorable meeting in Boston, and we invited people who are very well-known figures who are well outside the design camp to this meeting, closed door, private. And at a roundtable session, multiple people, 2 people came out and said, after they saw our evidence, they said, "You've got some really good work there. That's very strong." And then they realized later that that was recorded. And about a week later, one of them just railed against the whole thing and complained about the whole meeting, because I think he was afraid that we were going to run and take the audio clip and say, "This guy said this." Where even very well-established people who you think have nothing to fear, because they're very, very well-established, full tenure, highly regarded, they can be fearful of the punishment they will receive if they are seen to be open to an idea that is just, beyond the pale to the authority structures. And so you get this kind of behavior where in one context, they can be friendly and be honest and have their guard down. But then when they worry about the possibility of being punished for that, they very quickly, you become an enemy.
Yeah, thanks.
Or at least not a friend.
Yeah. Could I put a question to Doug?
Yeah.
Doug, I've really enjoyed reading your book about intuition. How do you respond to the point that there are some areas of science that are counterintuitive? Quantum physics, for example, particles being in 2 places at one time and so on. These seem to be counterintuitive things, and yet they are genuinely scientific. How do you respond to that objection to being guided always by your intuition?
Yes, well, I respond to it by saying I'm not giving a blanket endorsement of intuition. So you're absolutely right. There are, particularly in particle physics or quantum physics, there are some profoundly counterintuitive things that appear to be true. And even the physicists, as they were discovering these things, they didn't want to believe they were true because they seemed so bizarre. Einstein was one of them who didn't find these things to be palatable and very much hoped that they would be overturned. So I'm not giving in undeniable a blanket endorsement of intuition. What I'm doing instead is arguing that there are certain intuitions about very commonsensical, we can't live without having a right idea of this things like there being a real world out there, okay? And those intuitions are reliable. And design happens to be one of those. The ability to look at something and say, someone did this, someone had to have done this, because there's no other way that this would happen. And you don't even think, the 4-year-old is not even meditating on it. It's just instant. If you had, as a 4-year-old, spilled all your wooden blocks out on your bedroom floor and you go off and have lunch and you come back and a castle has been built out of your blocks, you know your brother or your sister came in there and did that. You don't even give a moment's thought to any alternative. It can't have happened by chance. So there are special intuitions that are reliable, and that's not going to be true of all intuitions.
Thanks, Doug. Can I move on? A couple of questions from viewers, and I meant to remind anyone watching the live stream, if you want questions to put to Doug, or you want questions to be put to Doug, please can you type them in the chat on the YouTube stream, and I will do my best to put them to him. But the first of the two I've got, Doug, is this. In the pasta example, the letters are improbable, but the cleared areas are impossible by laws of diffusion as found in cells. Isn't arguing impossibility more of a slam dunk than improbability?
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that. I wouldn't say that they're, I mean, obviously, if I dilute the pasta enough, I think what this person is saying, surface tension is going to want to make these pasta letters come together, and that's true. But if you pour in certain ways and you have more broth than letters, obviously you could get a pouring that would have some places where you don't have letters. So I wouldn't want to say that's impossible. Totally agree on the point that if you can say, or to the extent that you can say, the probability P equals 0, then you've got an impossibility. And actually what I presented today is a P equals 0 situation and a P equals so small that we should not even be having this discussion situation. And I want to argue that both of those can be very, very strong. If you recognize that a universe, a physical universe like ours, has only so much in the way of probabilistic resources, there's only so many ways that things can happen to solve a clever problem by accident. And if you can show that the number of ways, that the number of opportunities would have to have been extraordinarily larger than can have been, then you've got something that I think is, for all practical purposes, as strong as a P equals 0 argument. But in arguing that we cannot be physical, that our mind cannot be physical, I'm arguing that you have a P equals 0 argument. In other words, it can't be that way, because if you insist that it is that way, you've lost everything. So there's no way to make a coherent case for a physicalist view of reality.
Okay, thanks. And the next question was this. You said that mind is completely separate from matter. What is the connection between thought and the brain?
Well, this is a deep mystery. What I'm saying, what I'm insisting is, if we try to make thought into a physical process, we lose it. Okay, and I gave the argument for that. If we try to shoehorn thought and mental experience into the realm of the physical, we end up destroying it and losing all confidence in it. And then we don't even know there's physics. We lose everything. Somewhere, I argue in the book that the human brain is the most remarkable physical structure in the universe, bar none. And it's for this reason. I don't know the answer. What's more remarkable is people who have been studying the brain for entire careers. And if you catalog all the experience we have in brain studies, neurologists don't know the answer. Nobody knows exactly how this works, but it's clear by the fact that I can move my hand and move my mouth, it's clear that thoughts are somehow getting pushed into, that my body is in service of the thoughts, in flowing outward. And the opposite is also true. When you're speaking and I hear you, my body is receiving things that get pushed up and allow my brain functions in order that something gets pushed up somewhere in my brain such that my mind becomes aware of what's before me. So I have no idea exactly how this works. I argue in a course that I teach on this, that this is yet another very profound argument for the existence of God, and that in fact, whatever is mediating this handoff between the non-physical and the physical and vice versa has to be intimately familiar with both of these worlds. And I argue that God is the only answer to this. God is the one who knows my thoughts before I think them, and God is the one who knows every atom in my body and how it works. And it has to be a God thing, this intimate understanding of what my immaterial thoughts are and pushing it into the body structure that he is intimately familiar with as well, and vice versa. When things happen and sensory input comes to the brain, God is the one who then takes that and pushes it into a mental experience. That's the only explanation that I think is coherent.
All right, thank you very much. I've got to the end of the questions that I've got at the moment. I was going to give you an opportunity before we bring things to an end, Doug, to plug your latest book. So, Price of Panic, Tyranny of Experts, I think was the subtitle. Am I right that the book came out in the period that might be described as the window between the first and second waves of the pandemic?
Yes, it came out on October 13th. US, I assume probably UK was the same date or very close. It's called The Price of Panic, How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe.
Okay.
In October, but we had to have it finished, of course, before that. So we had to finish our writing by June is when we had to have our full thing in, and July we had to have it locked in. So we were anticipating the second wave when we wrote it.
Well, that was going to be my question. A lot has happened since June. Has what's happened confirmed what's in the book, or if you were writing the book now, would it have different conclusions?
It's a great question. Obviously, if we were writing it now, we'd be able to include a lot that we didn't. We were able to include some very interesting things like the rioting happening in the US and all the unrest that happened in late May, I think it was, in the US. So we were able to get some of those things in. Obviously, in the US, this has been a crazy, crazy year because election year, it's just been crazy in all kinds of ways. Everyone's eager for 2021 to come along. There are a lot of things that we would include now if we had the ability to add them. But I think in terms of the major brushstrokes, the idea that we had in our sense of this was right, and it has proven right. And that is that a pandemic and a public health response to it has to be bigger than the understanding of an epidemiologist. And even the epidemiological understanding has to include lots of epidemiologists. It can't just be one or two who say, this is happening, we have to do this. You guys, Imperial College London, as you know, ended up being a model that affected the entire world in a way that we think was not healthy, because you have Neil Ferguson and his group coming up with numbers, and somehow that got pushed into the forefront, and people were responding on that one result. And it's not even an experimental result. It's people putting numbers into a model and then saying that the numbers came out of the model. We just think that this should have been a much bigger exercise of getting input from many different modelers, but not just modelers, business people who know what this sort of thing does to an economy, healthcare workers, people who work in mental health, who know how devastating it is to send people home, particularly people who might be being sent home to dangerous homes. There's all kinds of facets to this that are extraordinarily complicated, and they all have to do with human flourishing and human well-being. And somehow, early on, our national leaders gravitated toward a few pieces of this, and we think that was a mistake. And that drove the lockdown policy in a way that we don't think really probably had much effect on the progression of the virus, which is very tragic. But on top of that tragic is the disastrous effect this has had in other respects. If you lock down an economy, you ruin small businesses, you put people out of work, you put people into harmful situations. This is probably true in the UK and the US, that calls to child abuse hotlines were cut by at least 50%. The reason not being that there was a reduction in child abuse, but rather that the main people who would be reporters, teachers, coaches, pediatricians, people outside the home who see something wrong are the ones who are picking up that phone and calling the hotline. And those people were no longer seeing children. So these children were who are in abusive situations. The abuse continues. And it goes way beyond that. You have some of the great doctors and scientists in the UK who've talked about the plummeting cancer screening during lockdown, that cancer screening went down to about half or less, both on both sides of the Atlantic of what it was before. When you look at the number of early cancers that are detected through screening, this can only be a nightmare when we go 6, 7, 8, 9 months with greatly reduced screening. That's going to be more cancer. So we're going to be seeing knock-on effects of this for many years to come, and they're going to be.
Well, I think that's probably made a few people interested in getting the book, Doug. So I will add my name to the list. Perhaps it's another way of looking at consensus. When you mentioned Imperial College, perhaps the consensus, so-called, was not as broad or multidisciplinary as it could have been, which then affects the value of the consensus.
Absolutely.
I will finish with the final question that's come in. So the very last question of the night is this, and it's: what do you think is the probability of there being a planet that will have the same qualities as Earth for supporting life?
Oh, that's a great question. I know some planetary scientists who might be able to put a number on that. I think from what I've read, so this is not my area, Earth, if we take away the biosphere and we're just looking at how remarkable the physical environment, how remarkable planet Earth is in terms of what it offers on the crust, in terms of the seas, having a water, oxygen, nitrogen atmosphere. What we have here in terms of just the physical accommodation of Earth, I think is probably extraordinarily rare. I don't think anyone's made a strong case that there's anything else that would compare, but of course we're looking and cataloging. People are doing exoplanet science, are looking for Earth-like planets. I doubt any of them are truly Earth-like, so they're using very broad categories. But a bigger point is there's a lot of wrong thinking, I think, among space explorers and exoplanet scientists, that if you only have a few of these conditions right, if you have water and you have the right elements in your crust and you have, the right sort of temperature range, then life is bound to happen. That all comes from this idea that the probabilities are not that insurmountable, and that is just a wrong idea. So you could have a bajillion truly Earth-like planets out there, and unless God acted and put life on them, they will be sterile. That's my prediction.
All right. Thank you ever so much, Doug. That's it for me. I'm going to hand you back to David Galloway just for some closing comments. And I don't know if you remember this from your time in the UK or whether it was on then, but we finished just in time for people to watch tonight's show of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. So don't know if you're familiar with that program, but for UK viewers, hopefully they've only lost the first 10 minutes. So, but thank you again for the talk, and I'll hand you back to David Galloway. Thanks.
David, thank you very much. I can't tell you how dismayed I am to hear you say that that last little comment about popular TV in the United Kingdom. Do you know, I was just reflecting a little bit on what Doug was saying about the debate and the tyranny surrounding the so-called expert view or the scientific view about coronavirus. And there was an article in the British Medical Journal that I follow from time to time, and the subtitle, it was about known unknowns in COVID-19. And the authors had written, the more certain someone is about COVID-19, the less you should trust them. I thought that was quite an interesting comment. Doug, thank you very much. David, thank you. Doug, that's been a really fantastic talk. I just noticed that one of the last comments on our YouTube feed was to the fact that you were a brilliant speaker, one of the best ever on this platform. So I think you should take that as just one example of the positive feedback that we've received so far. I recognize it's just after 1 p.m. in Orange County, California. So we appreciate you taking the time, effort and energy in putting that together for us. And thanks also to the viewers who have fertilised the discussion with some questions and comments. Just as we conclude, let me just remind you about our website. I've asked Jonathan to put the details in the chat. And we're not planning a webinar during December, but we do have some plans for a program of monthly webinars next year. And the next one I'm really quite excited about. It's a date for your schedule. Note this, it'll be January the 18th, 2021. And we really look forward to welcoming for the first time Gunter Bechley, who's going to be joining us to address the topic of the discontinuities in the fossil record. So with that, I think we'll end today's webinar. Thank you all very much for engaging and for watching, and do recommend it to your friends and colleagues that they can pick up some of these nuggets of wisdom as well. Thank you very much, and goodbye from C4ID.
Thank you.